organized in partnership with the Ford Foundation, the Land Portal Foundation, the 10-Year Facility, and the Thomson Reuters Foundation. So this initiative promotes the importance of recognizing legal ownership of indigenous peoples in local communities' land rights as a prerequisite for achieving national and international goals for forest governance, food security, climate mitigation, economic development, and human rights. So the Land Dialogue series will run once a month until October, with each webinar tackling a different topic. I'm Fábio Teixeira. I'm the correspondent for Thomson Reuters Foundation in Brazil, and I'm delighted to be your host today. Well, we have a fantastic panel who I will introduce to you shortly. First, I'll ask you guys to listen to a little bit of housekeeping from my part. The webinar will take place in English and it will be simultaneously translated to Spanish, French, and Portuguese. To assess that, please see the channels located at the bottom of your screen. We'll have opening remarks and a discussion for about an hour. And finally, I'll take questions from the audience. This will take us about 90 minutes, the webinar. If you do have questions, please post them using the Q&A button. It's at the bottom of your screen and not the chat box feature. And then I'll fill those to the panelists so we don't have to go through all the pain of going up or muting themselves to ask questions. And feel free to tweet using the hashtag Land Dialogues and follow live tweeting from the Land Portal and the 10-Year Facility Twitter accounts. Also, I should add that today's session is being recorded and that we will send you the link afterwards. To begin, I'd like to get to know you guys in the audience. And we have almost 400 people signed up, and we know that today's topic is interesting. So let's find a bit more about who is out there and where everyone is from. If you would like to introduce yourselves via the chat and tell us where you are joining us, that would be great. Okay, thanks very much, everyone. So let's now take a moment to introduce our panel and let them speak about their experiences. So first of all, we have Joan Carlin. She's an indigenous activist from the Cordillera, Philippines. She has been working on indigenous issues at the grassroots level to international levels for more than 20 years. Her field of expertise includes human rights, sustainable development, environment, and climate change, as well as the principles and applications of free, prior, and informed consent. She's currently the co-convener of the Indigenous Peoples Major Group for Sustainable Development and works directly with indigenous organizations and networks across the globe. Next, we have Ikau Anjali. Ikau is an environmental activist. She is co-founder and director of Friends of Lake Turkana, a grassroots organization that seeks to foster economic and environmental justice in the Lake Turkana Basin. Ikau completed a master's degree in public policy and political science at Stony Brook University in New York. In 2012, she was awarded the Goldman Environmental Prize for her voicing on behalf of Northern Kenyan indigenous communities about the environmental implications of the Gilby Gibb Third Dam. And next, we have Athena Ronquillo Ballesteros. Athena is the managing director of Global Climate Strategies for the Climate Leadership Initiative that leverages her deep climate expertise and extensive global network to guide new climate philanthropists to outsize the impact. Athena, please, I'll let you guys know that Athena will be joining us for the first hour of this conversation, and we will answer questions via email. We'll share her contact information on the chat box. And finally, we'll have Marcelo Guerra. Marcelo is the president of CONAPIP, the national coordinating body of indigenous peoples in Panama. CONAPIP is working with indigenous authorities and the government to advance the territorial security of the indigenous peoples of Panama. Okay, now let's get into the Q&A. And please, I'll let you guys. I remind you guys that you can ask questions via the box below, but please not the chat box, the Q&A box. And I'll please ask the panelists to keep their answers relatively brief so you can cover a good amount of ground. So before we start, I'll also invite you guys to take a look at the trailer entitled Panama Tenure Tales. Sorry guys, I realize I'm not hearing any sound from the trailer. Hi guys, sorry for the lack of sound. We're trying to figure out how to solve it, but so we don't lose any more time, I'd like to start by asking Marcelo a few questions. And Marcelo, can you hear me okay?
Sí, le escucho, le escucho, le escucho. ¿Aló?
Okay.
Le escucho.
Okay, thank you very much, Marcelo.
¿Aló?
So let's start. Marcelo, what is the renewable energy? And Marcelo, what did you learn from what is seen in the trailer, and how can things be done differently? Marcelo, are you there?
Muy buenos días. Ante todo, pues, primero sería el aprendizaje que hemos aprendido de una lucha de los pueblos indígenas de Panamá, es un reconocimiento oficial de su territorio. Cada pueblo defendemos nuestro territorio y es una lucha bien larga que hemos tenido y que hasta el momento pues seguiremos luchando, y las áreas que están todavía no están titulados y queremos la seguridad para ello. Y bueno, a través de TF apoyos, nosotros no hemos estado avanzando para darle para darle y tener esos derechos hacia nosotros los pueblos indígenas. Por otro lado, pues también reconocimiento oficial de nuestra tierra, que es importante porque de ellas vivimos, de ellos comemos, y por eso que, por lo tanto, hemos visto la seguridad y el aprendizaje que hemos tenido en este momento, una lucha bien larga y bien, no ha sido duro para nosotros como pueblos indígenas de Panamá. Sí. Y también, una parte también, en el tercer lugar, sabemos que ha sido una presión, y la presión es también de gobiernos hacia los pueblos indígenas, las invasiones de parte de los colonos también, pero gracias a eso pues nosotros hemos estado desarrollando en ejercicio conjuntamente para poder en la unidad de los pueblos indígenas y tener la seguridad territorial. Y en Panamá pues existen 12 congresos y 7 pueblos indígenas. Cada uno de ellos nosotros nos unamos juntos para poder buscar la alternativa de la seguridad territorial de cada uno de diferentes comarcas y diferentes sectores indígenas que hay en Panamá. Esa sería la parte que queríamos explicarle.
Thank you, Marcelo. So could you please explain what is the renewable energy plan for Panama and how it is affecting indigenous peoples?
Bueno, primer lugar, la demanda energética en el país ha sido en aumento. Primero, la generación impulsada por combustibles fósiles y cada uno de ellos hemos visto situaciones que realmente en tres hidroeléctricas energéticos que hay en Panamá, y algunos recientemente, creo que está también en la comarca Renewable, dentro de la frontera, y el otro está en la comarca Nazos. La situación es que nosotros, como pueblos indígenas, no queremos, como vieron el video, no queremos dañar nuestros ríos, porque sabemos que el río es naturaleza de nosotros y de ellos vivimos y queremos verlo bonito, porque realmente hemos visto situaciones que cada uno de ellos, como han visto el video, eh, a veces sacrifican a los pescados y hay otros y que realmente dañan el río en vez de estar buenísimo para visita y eso, a algunos turistas y otros. Pero entonces cuando empezamos o se empieza a hacer hidroeléctrica en esa parte, entonces ya dañamos el río. Y por lo tanto, pues hemos visto en Panamá que es una situación bien complicada y que también en el pleno o en la misma comunidad y no le dan esa oportunidad y tampoco, sino siempre se llevan a la energía para otros países y nosotros quedamos, el tiempo queda afectado a nivel de nosotros.
Yeah,
¿Aló?
that's fascinating. Actually, the same thing happens in Brazil as well with dams and indigenous communities. Uh, so, finally, Marcelo, what do you think needs to happen at a
Sí,
national level? Sorry?
bueno, sí, lo que ocurre, ¿qué tendrá que ocurrir en Panamá? La lucha es grande a nivel de los pueblos indígenas, como el caso de Bayano, que está dentro también, creo que una demanda. Y ocurre que a veces ya se pierden las luchas, se pierden el interés de realmente la entidad, y principalmente la cultura también en el pleno. Entonces van pasando y eso es lamentoso porque realmente los pueblos indígenas, nosotros no queremos que eso puede pasar y que eso puede carecer poco tiempo, las pérdidas de los peces y la pérdida de otros, y por lo tanto hemos pedido al gobierno y principalmente los pueblos indígenas también, hemos visto que también en Panamá el tema de la que no se ha hecho es la ratificación del Convenio 19 y Panamá no lo tenemos. Y así, bueno, y el gobierno no quieren darle ese derecho para nosotros, para como entonces, por lo tanto, puede ocurrir que esto puede ser hasta una demanda a nivel de esa parte de los pueblos indígenas. Para no podemos hacer eso. ¿No?
Thank you, Marcelo. Now we'll turn to John Carlin, please. So, John, can you tell us a little about the implications of renewable energy development to land and resource rights of indigenous peoples in terms of challenges and opportunities, considering that this is critical in combating climate change and achieving sustainable development for everyone?
Yeah, thanks, Fabio. The implications of renewable energy to land tenure of indigenous peoples is profound, especially as it poses a serious threat to the exercise and protection of our rights over lands and our resources. As you have seen in the case of Panama, as presented by Marcelo, their riverine system, which is their resource, is under threat for destruction by hydro dams, which is part of the renewable energy. And we also see these cases of land grabbing happening in Mexico in the case of windmill farms, also in the windmill farms in Norway and in Kenya. So land grabbing is now becoming a common problem, a common challenge because of the imposition of renewable energy in indigenous territories. But I must say that we are supporting the just transition from fossil fuel to renewable energy. It's not that we are opposing renewable energy per se. The problem is that if it's being implemented under business as usual instead of being being a transformational shift in a way that it respects the rights of communities that are hosting this renewable energy. And if we talk about indigenous peoples, this means that there should be the transformation that we want to see from the just transition, if we are to make it as under a human rights-based approach, is to ensure the protection of our rights to our lands, territories, and resources, our right to manage also our resources, including the respect for our self-governance systems, and also to ensure that our sustainable livelihoods are protected. So these are imperative if we are to shift from fossil fuel to renewable energy. And once we do that shift, then indigenous peoples are enabled to better manage our resources and also provides more support to sustainable livelihoods and also the empowerment of women in harnessing our resources to benefit communities.
Thank you, Joan. Another question for you. Could you tell us a little bit about your initiative, the Right Energy Partnership, and how it can be a model for human rights-based approach for advancing energy transition? What are the goals of this partnership?
Yes, so the reason behind why we set up or initiated the Right Energy Partnership is precisely to address the problems, the inherent problems in the way renewable energy is being implemented that is leading to the violation of our collective and individual rights as indigenous peoples. And it is also exacerbating inequality and marginalization of indigenous peoples. So the Right Energy Partnership is an indigenous-led partnership that is based on a human rights-based approach to renewable energy and also upholds social equity and empowerment of women as well as indigenous communities. So the goals are, one, to ensure that energy development in indigenous territories fully respects and fully aligned to the respect and protection of human rights. And second is to provide access to renewable energy to indigenous communities, which are hosting a lot of renewable energy, but are not getting the energy. As Marcelo has mentioned, we're not even the beneficiaries of this energy. So what we want now is that there will be community-based renewable energy that is driven by communities to serve their self-determined development, including sustainable ways of resource management, and that it also allows the meaningful participation of women and empowerment of women in this endeavor. I must, perhaps I want to mention here that in the negotiations on renewable energy or clean energy for all, what was, there's a lot of commitment, for example, on efficient cooking fuel, because they said that would liberate women from this kind of work. And I raised, yeah, that's true, that we should address cooking, making cooking efficient, but at the same time, we should also not tie down women to cooking, because cooking should be a responsibility for men and women. And that's precisely the problem, that if we continue to domesticate women for cooking, then we are not also addressing the issue of shared responsibility and gender equity. So I mean, I just mentioned that because for me, it's really when we look at the issue of energy, we should also be mindful that we are indeed empowering women, particularly that they participate in decision making, so that their perspectives and aspirations are also fully accounted.
Thanks, John. That's fascinating. So as COP26 is approaching and leaders across the world are taking decisions to implement the Paris Agreement, what are the messages to them in relation to land tenure and energy transition for Indigenous peoples?
I think it's important to hammer that we cannot effectively address climate change without the protection of land tenure of Indigenous peoples. And we cannot continue to be talking about false solutions to climate change. For example, carbon trading under nature-based solutions, when we are not providing the enabling environment for Indigenous peoples to continue to contribute in protecting our planet, protecting biodiversity, and that is underpinned by the need to ensure protection of the rights of Indigenous peoples to lands, territories, and resources, and that Indigenous people should be regarded as actors, rights holders, and partners in finding solutions or advancing solutions to climate change, and that we should not be regarded as enemies. And that is really the narrative that we want to change, that we as actors and as rights holders be part of the decisions, but also be in the driving seat with the protection of our rights, especially our rights to our lands, territories, and resources, and our well-being and our dignity.
Thanks very much, John. So, Athena,
Fabio, can I weigh in on the COP question?
Sure.
Goes to
The
John.
floor is all yours.
Just like with John and I think a few others, some of us have been following this process from both the inside and the outside. Well, first of all, thank you everybody, and good morning from my side of the world. I think just on the COP question, this is probably one of the few opportunities where I know, and it will be announced publicly, but I think some of you are aware that there's a very big effort on the part of Indigenous peoples coalitions from all over the world, led by many of the leaders who are on this call, with philanthropy and a few champion governments, as we call them, to make sure that there is, as nature-based solutions, as climate finance, as energy transition commitments are announced, that there's also a big package of work that is really centered on the role of Indigenous peoples and communities to protect their land and territories while meeting sustainable development and climate goals. And I think this is what used to be an impossible vision may be happening at this COP, but it will require this group's collective work and push to make sure that whatever resources or attention or technical support and capacity and other kinds of data and research commitments are presented at the COP, that centers equity and justice amongst all things, and that Indigenous communities and vulnerable communities from the most vulnerable countries in the world participate and have a voice and space in those announcements. So I just want to flag that as a major opportunity. I also want to respond to, I don't know if the other panelists are seeing the questions. There was a question around interactions between Indigenous peoples and businesses when considering ESG and corporate social responsibility. I want to tell you that obviously there's a tension there. Not all companies who embrace corporate social responsibility and ESG necessarily are going to align with our vision of awarding tenurial rights to Indigenous communities in the longer term, because that really conflicts with the business model. But the example I want to flag to you would be the smaller businesses and the social enterprises I have worked with in the past. And these are sort of smaller joint ventures. And I have seen how social enterprises who really care about Sustainable Development Goals number 7, delivering energy access, have played a major role in ensuring that energy services to the poorest and most vulnerable communities are put front and center of the business model, right? So it's a very different kind of business model. And they get their resources from either venture philanthropy, where I came from, or they get it from impact investors. So there's a slice of the private sector that can actually be partners of Indigenous communities and in Indigenous territories in this conversation. And I just want to highlight that. And perhaps in future conversations, we could put communities together with this mission-oriented social enterprises, because their business model is really meant to benefit communities, particularly women and children in highly vulnerable areas of the world. And it's a very different business model from some of the companies that Johan is alluding to.
Thanks, Athena. Let's keep going with you then. If I could ask you a question about the lessons we can learn from other communities that have participated in renewable energy planning, and what other Indigenous peoples can draw from those experiences.
Yeah, so I think I have 3 or 4 quick lessons that I've learned as a practitioner on renewable energy, on climate and finance. And this is obviously speaking from personal experience, not necessarily from my new purchase, part of the Climate Leadership Initiative. Although I must point out that there's a huge role for philanthropy in this space, as we are doing now, trying to raise money for the 10-year facility and all the other Indigenous peoples and local community-led solutions. So I think one, which is the subject of your series of webinars, I think ownership of land and getting tenurial rights, and league communities owning the land and resources where renewable energy projects are sited need to be front and center of designing any renewable energy project. I can tell you that that's not automatically the default for project developers. So there's a lot of resistance from communities because they don't get consulted from the beginning. But the successful ones that I've seen, particularly for micro hydro projects in Indonesia, in Vietnam, and a lot of decentralized community-based solar projects in India, again, in partnership with social enterprises, have land ownership as a primary sort of recipe for success, right? And the project developers and the small businesses who come and partner with communities take that into account. And so the second lesson learned as a result of that model is that there's equitable benefit sharing, which I think Marcelo and Joan alluded to earlier. You have to design renewable energy projects with community ownership in mind, and therefore equitable benefit sharing, so that you are not just generating power to benefit nearby communities and not benefiting the community that's hosting the project. I think the third piece that I've learned is what we're calling demand side management, where you are trying to design renewable energy projects based on actual demand from the community that's hosting it. this sounds very simple, but we've seen, particularly in large scale hydro and traditional fossil fuel projects that earlier speakers have alluded to, that they develop the project from very outdated GDP-based energy policy and planning models. And they would say, oh, this community needs 500 megawatts of hydro. Well, no one has bothered to ask what the actual demand is from the communities in the area and what future ventures in that area, what kind of power demand is needed. Usually it really just comes from the top. And the ones that are designed, I think one of my favorite examples is actually in the Cordilleras, led by a group called Sibat, where a series of micro hydro projects, very small, 5 kilowatt projects, benefiting 25 households, and there's a series of them, is so successful because the system is designed to meet the community demand, right? So it's not top down. And then finally, I think what I would say as another lesson learned is that Indigenous communities and social enterprises working together have to build an ecosystem. I call it the surround sound of stakeholders and partners who will make the projects successful. And I think the 2 or 3 partners that you really have to keep in mind, one is obviously you have to have your energy regulators or your champions in the utilities to allow you to build the kind of projects that you want to build. To take the Panama example, they have a very strong voice and they can influence energy policy and planning officials and regulators to make sure that the projects are designed and given incentives based on what Indigenous communities are demanding, not based on what the corporate interests are demanding them to do. And again, that's very difficult, but it only comes with, collective action from different responsibilities. The other 2 stakeholders important as part of your building that ecosystem would be the local businesses and the entrepreneurs who are mission oriented, because Indigenous communities know how to manage and protect their land, but they haven't been exposed to some of the technologies that will ultimately benefit their people, right? So you have to partner with the right people who have done their best to diligence the technologies and the process of building the systems with ownership in mind. And finally, you have to work with a set of mission-related investors because the projects will not have any form of sustainability and longevity if you don't partner with mission-related financiers and investors.
Thanks, John. I think you already talked a little bit about this, but could you expand a little bit on what national, international partners can do to support the role of Indigenous people in curating and implementing renewable energy projects?
Yeah, I mean, I alluded to this earlier, but I would highlight 2 or 3 really important partnerships. I mean, one, a few of you have already mentioned Sustainable Energy for All as an intergovernmental body. In order for Indigenous communities to really be heard loudly and more powerfully, you need to own some of those energy compacts, right? And Joan, you know what I'm talking about. It's like we have to lead by example, because if we don't push the kind of business models that we want to see for our communities, it's not going to happen. So you need to make sure that you are partnering with the right champions from intergovernmental bodies, whether it's IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Network, that has a very bespoke program for Indigenous and vulnerable communities, by the way. The Sustainable Energy for All, which are now developing energy compacts with different stakeholders. And obviously your own government champions. We don't always have government champions in many parts of the world, but in many places we do have some friends in government, friends in regulatory agencies. That's one. I actually think we in philanthropy have a role to play. Again, Ford Foundation is a big supporter of all your work. We are your best source of early stage, de-risking project development capital, because we are grant makers. We don't ask for a return on investment, and we take risks, especially for projects that involve Indigenous communities, because there's a lot of political risks, technical risks, sovereign risks. None of your private sector partners will be able to do that. So you have to be able to tap philanthropic support. And then finally, I cannot overemphasize this, but in any part of the world, there is a cadre of social entrepreneurs, and tap into them, tap into the diaspora and social enterprises. I actually wrote the piece on this together with some friends a couple of years ago called Community-Based Business Models with Social Enterprises. And I'm happy to share that with the audience. But two things I've learned: most of the founders of social enterprises for renewable energy are members of the diaspora, right? So these are Indian, Filipino, Southeast Asian, African, Latino entrepreneurs who have gone abroad to study. They all come back and they all develop their own startups that are mission oriented. Those are your best partners because they know how to deliver the technology in ways that will actually benefit. And again, they will have to work with financial institutions. So there must be local banks, development banks, impact investors, and venture philanthropists and venture capitalists who are willing to take risks and have a smaller return of investment because they know they're doing mission-related investments.
Thanks so much, Athena. Hi, Ikau, can you hear me?
Yes, Fabio, I can.
Oh, thank you. Oh, hello. So, Ikau, could you please talk a little bit about how your country, Kenya, is being affected by the renewable energy plan that they have, and how it is affecting indigenous peoples?
All right. Thanks, Fabio, and thanks. Good afternoon, good morning to my fellow panelists, and for those who've joined us. Thank you for joining this important conversation. I think for Kenya, for East Africa, for the African continent, there's just a mix of conversations. So yes, on paper, on paper you can hear, the presidents, the ministers talking about shifting to renewable energy, but at the same time, there's still an energy mix with fossil fuels. But having said that, you can see a rush, especially where there's financing towards renewable energy. So when the European Investment Bank was putting money into geothermal, there was a rush to get land, which happens to be in indigenous lands, to explore for geothermal. When there was an interest in the largest wind farm in Africa, the Lake Turkana wind farm, there was a rush, which then in many cases, because of this conversation of shifting technology, as Athena was talking about, the technological part, the rush to move, to transition the technology from fossil fuels to renewable, there's, let's say, a watering down of safeguards, of processes. So while there's a demand by financial institutions like the European Investment Bank for free, prior, informed consent, you see that being ignored under the term public participation. How many people does it need to then okay or authorize or give consent is another question. So you see that an increase in the uptake of land. So in the case of Lake Turkana wind power, everybody, all the financiers, including Google, who had an interest in investing in the wind farm, all wanted to have a piece of the cake, but nobody was asking why the communities had a concern. In 2012, 2013, then when the conversation began, in 2015, the local community in Sarima, where the wind farm is based, went to court. And even when the process was in court, people, the government gave guarantee. Financial institutions, including the Dutch embassy, who was supporting some of the SOMO funds, was actually supporting this process, all because there was a big global discussion around transitioning to green energy. So you can see this push for the transition to green energy, but at the expense of indigenous lands and territories, mostly pastoralist lands. And I think that itself is a case for concern. As of yesterday, I was seeing, some comments about the Sami land and Norway, the court in Norway making a judgment that the land was acquired illegally. And the Sami people saying now they want all the projects discontinued. In Kenya, The same happened. The courts actually indicated that the land was acquired illegally. However, goes back and says, we would like the land regularized, yet it is an illegal allocation of land. So you find institutions, institutions are actually, bending over backwards to legalize illegalities related to land just because it is renewable energy or what they say is a public good.
Okay, thank you, Ikau. So could you please talk a little bit about the opportunities for indigenous people to be included in the sustainable development goals when it comes to energy transition? How do land write figures into that?
So, I mean, having participated in the tenure facility and the conversation around securing tenure for indigenous people, it is a very critical, we have got to look at this, the link between securing tenure. But then in the cases like in most African countries and in most global South, there's this narrative that the land is yours, even if you have title, it doesn't necessarily secure you from dispossession by the state. And that for me is a very critical discussion that we need to delve into. One is, if we're going to secure tenure for communities, we've got to then say, so when they have the secure tenure, what happens next? And that's and the use of capital, the use of corporations and the state to fragment the collective use of that land, the collective ownership of that land is visible. So we've got to expand the conversation beyond just secure of tenure to then saying what is the sustainability of the secure of tenure, especially with the increased capital in specific geographies where we can say is resource frontiers. And if you look at the energy, SDG on access to energy, listening to Akana, we've got to also then expand it. Yes, technologically in indigenous lands, but then who owns this technology? And I think it's really important for us to then either decide, are we going to use natural capital as part of the ownership of this energy development on our lands? Because listening to the Panama situation, even here whether it is hydroelectric power, whether it is the wind farm, it is the generation is done on indigenous and local communities, lands and territories, but it is transmitted to a central grid. So there's no decentralized systems at the moment. So it's centralized grid. And then after that, you're then the last people to be decided based on the economic numbers, the GDP numbers that are used, the GDP numbers are used to say, okay, is this a high economic zone? Most indigenous lands globally are not seen as high economic zones, but only for extraction, not for production. And so we've then, so that for me is one of the challenges, that we can generate the power, we can give consent, but then what next? Do we own this power? What percentage of this power do we own? And because we really are not at the center of the conversation, we are then thrown at corporate social responsibility, a school, a toilet, a water point, which in fact should be state provided. So then now the companies come in and give us that, and then we see that is the process. And I think it is very critical in these conversations to then separate the two between corporate social responsibility, but what is really owned, because the resources, the land, the resources, water, all this is actually resources that are productive for these communities. And the fact that they're being taken up or being enclosed by the development of energy does not make the energy is not more superior to the production of by the indigenous people using these resources. So I think it is, there's an opportunity now as the conversation of energy transition happens, access to energy happens. We've then got to say, who's developing the energy? What stake do the local communities, indigenous people have in the production of this energy, whether it is through land as natural capital or otherwise? But then, and it's not only at that point, but they are there throughout the entire process, ensuring that they actually are able to afford. Because it's one thing, one of the biggest discussions around SDGs is that we're talking about, how many people are connected to the grid, but how many people are able to sustainably afford to pay for the energy that is produced and they can access.
Yeah, thanks, Ikau. So what is your organization? What is your organization, the Friends of Lake Turkana, doing in this regard? How it is working in the region?
So we work at various levels. So at the grassroots level, energy justice linked to land and environmental rights, territorial rights is a very critical part of our work. Working in partnership with Joanne and the Right Energy Partnership is allowing us to not only look at the grassroots position, but then expanding it. So at the national level, what is the interest of the government in terms of energy development? Where are they doing this? But I think for a long time, not only Indigenous people, civil society looked at these issues in silos. So based either on our particular geographies where we are working, countries and I think through the Right Energy Partnership we've started to expand that conversation, looking at some of the questions. Lithium generation in South America, the same lithium, cobalt, nickel, aluminium, copper is being generated within the African continent. So as much as we are talking about this, it's trying to link the voices to look at what is the political economy around analysis of energy generation, distribution, who is actually pushing this agenda, and the local communities who own the lands and territories, where are they in this conversation? But also looking at it not only from wind and others, but also looking at the cost, because there's a cost of land, there's a cost of livelihood, there's a cost of water, there's a cost of displacement because of the renewable energy transition. And we've got to start asking ourselves, who's bearing the cost? While globally we will talk about what has happened, what would happen, reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, yes. But then what is happening to local communities who tend not to be on the table and whose impact is minimized for the bigger conversations that are going to be happening at the COP26. So it's really critical for us to, so that's what we are doing. We're trying to amplify the voices, trying to link with existing work, but also trying to create conversations between the Eastern, West Africa, South Africa, and the larger global South.
Thanks so much, Ikau. So, and thank you to all the other panelists. So now, before we go to the questions and answers from the audience, I think we managed to figure out what was wrong with the trailer. So we'll try to show it now again for you guys, please.
Hemos luchado desde 1973, una lucha muy grande, pero pues hemos logrado pues nuestra comarca y nos sentimos tan orgullosos.
Casi 2 años de obtener los títulos de propiedad colectiva de tierra, consideramos que es importante ya iniciar con un proceso que va paralelo a la protección del territorio, encaminada en búsqueda de mejores condiciones de vida.
En el Plan Nacional Energético del Gobierno encuentra 4 puntos en la cabecera de este gran río para la construcción de más hidroeléctrica.
Nosotros no vamos a permitir más hidroeléctricas dentro y queremos que ese río se mantenga así bonito y hermoso con muchos camarones como lo tenemos.
Queremos una comunidad que se mantenga la colectividad, que se mantenga la unidad, que se mantenga la seguridad entre nosotros mismos, porque al final ese es el valor que tiene nuestro pueblo.
Thank you. Second time is the charm. So, hi, John, do you want to speak? You're muted.
I was just raising my hand to respond to some of the questions.
Sure.
Just that I'm ready to respond to some of the questions in the chat.
Yeah, actually, the first questions to you, I'll just say it out loud for the other people to hear. So given the myriad challenges and threats to Indigenous people's rights, when considering the realization of large-scale energy projects, how can voluntary local reviews complement voluntary national reviews in ensuring equitable implementation and realization of the SDGs and protecting indigenous rights while states advance the renewable energy transition. So that's for you, and that's a complex one, I guess.
Yeah, it actually deals with the SDG processes, but I've responded to that, but basically saying that local voluntary reviews reflect the realities on the ground, and that should complement the voluntary national reviews. For those that are not familiar with the SDG, this is the process where each country, each state prepared their report on how they are implementing the SDGs, and that is called the voluntary national review. So it's basically a report on what progress they have done. But what I'm saying is that when we talk on equity and renewable energy, it's beyond the reporting. It's what it requires is the political will of states to really respect the rights of indigenous peoples and include appropriate targets and specific targets in conjunction with indigenous peoples. That is actually what's needed to be done, and that is really the gap in the SDGs. It's all about talks of leaving no one behind, but really lacking in action on the ground, really lacking the kind of partnership that is needed, that allows indigenous peoples to be part of the planning and designing actions to reach the SDGs, including in relation to access to renewable energy.
Thanks, John. So the next question is from Marcelo, but actually it's also to everyone else. So Marcelo, what interactions have taken place between indigenous people and businesses, especially when considering ESG and corporate social responsibility commitments that are indicated in business portfolios and are scrutinized by regulatory agencies, investors, customers, and other stakeholders? Also, a very specific and interesting question. Can you hear me okay, Marcelo? Do you get the question? Marcelo, can you hear me? Hello? Marcelo, are you there?
Fabio, maybe we should explain the audience that Marcelo is actually traveling to the Nassau community, which is where this film was filmed. And
okay.
he might have lost connectivity on the way.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so apologies for that. Maybe he will be available a little bit later.
Okay, so let's move on to a question to all panelists. Is there a danger that objecting to renewable projects undermines the campaigns to recognize the contribution to the environment made by indigenous people who control their own lands? In terms of public opinion, you seem a little bit contradictory, according to the questioner. If I could start with Ikau first, please.
Thank you. I do not think that asking for things to be done right is in any way contradicting. I think for me, I think it is an opportunity. We've always rushed and given sort of like the decisions, the development ideas is really for corporate. I think for the first time, we really have an opportunity, having seen what COVID did, having seen what the struggle and economic, sort of like the large economic development plan really during this 2020, 2021 year has allowed for a conversation to say, we're not building back better, but we are building it fresh. And for me, this is really an opportunity and ensuring that we don't, as Joan said, indigenous communities are not just victims. They are contributors to the development process. They are contributors, they are participants, they're, they're beneficiaries. And it is important to have that very inclusive process. And this itself, having this conversation, part of many other conversations, really is an opportunity to rethink outside the box. And I think that is what exactly we're doing here.
Thank you, Ikau. Athena, I know you have to leave in a little while, but if you could also weigh in, since you're here with us.
Sure. I mean, Ikau has said many of the points, but just to underscore 2 or 3 things. One is that I think whether we like it or not, there will always be a tension about the tension between corporate interests and indigenous communities, and I must say other vulnerable communities' interests. They just don't go together. They're not aligned, right? Because the interests and the outcomes that each of these stakeholders seek are completely in contradiction with each other. It's profits versus people, right? It's money versus land, right? It's wealth versus human rights and indigenous rights. So it is, I must say, very frankly, from a personal perspective, that's irreconcilable. I don't know why that's very difficult for me to say, because it's a very difficult concept. But let me just tell you that I think, and this is to answer 2 or 3 other questions in the thread, Fabio, if you allow me, because I have to go soon, and Joan and Ikau in the panel can pick it up. I think one is that we do have examples where we have struck, I wouldn't say it's a perfect balance, but we have managed to strike some semblance of balanced interests where renewable energy projects were able to take off, and in fact, displacing either diesel or coal-fired power projects. My province in the Philippines is an example, Negros, right? They're not necessarily indigenous communities, but the people have spoken and said, we don't want a series of 50 megawatt plants. We want power, right? Because there are livelihoods and enterprises that need to be powered by electricity. Where are we going to get it from? So the communities and the leaders worked with technical experts and regulators and champions in the utilities. And they manage, with support from organizations like ours, to kick out all the vested interests, corporate interests pushing for coal, and instead are building a series of wind farms in properties and land owned by peasants and local farmers, right? But the way, the Ikau's point is very important. The way the whole process of consultation and benefit sharing and procurement of not rights, but joint ventures was done in a very participatory way. And so the design of the project, the curation of the renewable energy projects, put communities' interests at the center of it all. And therefore, it avoided a lot of the mishaps. Now, this is a very difficult thing to model when you're doing large-scale energy projects, particularly large dams, large oil and coal-fired power plants. And therefore, there was also a question here around how do you make sure that FIT, which is feed-in tariffs, or RPS, renewable portfolio standards. And sorry for the people who are not energy wonks like us, that there's a lot of acronyms in this event. I'm happy to explain them to you offline. But I think the lesson there is that the interventions and the kind of influence strategies that our community needs to think about at the local level is somehow very distinct from when you're fighting the big fights at the national level. So in that video, you saw Marcelo and the partners challenging a national energy plan that is not responsive to their communities. That's a very difficult but potentially winnable fight. And one example I gave on the chat is when communities come together with consumer groups, with parliamentarians, with media, basically the constituency of groups represented in this call. If we all come together and push our governments who are going to the COP and say, you are going to commit to a ratchet mechanism to increase your ambition through your nationally determined contributions or your national action plans, you have to make sure that renewable energy targets contained in those plans actually benefit indigenous communities and the most vulnerable and poorest in our community, especially during and post-COVID. And that's not necessarily the case. So indigenous communities and coalitions alone will not win that fight. We're going to have to work with a coalition of partners in order to do that. I would say it's much easier to see, well, not much easier. It's a little bit easier to see progress on the ground in specific territories, because especially when you already have tenurial rights, because you have the number one recipe for success, which I mentioned earlier, Fabio, which is ownership of land. If you own the land and resources, you should be able to tell any corporate interest and government interest to design and curate the projects based on what the communities need and actual demand. You could control the conversation because you're already you're already at the front seat. But that's very difficult to do at the national and global setting. So I just wanted to differentiate that those two interventions and influence strategies from our end as civil society are quite distinct.
John, anything to add to that?
Yes, I just want to add another, there's a question on inspirational success stories. So since Athena has covered the good, the models or the good practice in the Philippines, I would just like to cite the ones in Malaysia. It's more again community-based renewable energy, combining solar and micro hydro. And the interesting, and this is in Sabah. And the interesting thing is when they develop the micro hydro for the energy needs of communities that also supports their livelihoods, and it's not just having light in their houses. It also led to better protection of the watershed, because the people realized that they need that water so that they have continuous source of power, of energy, and thereby they made regulations on how to better protect the watershed, and they have also learned how to manage the community, to manage the micro hydro. In a way that the community are able to collectively decide as well on how to manage the risk, to maintain and generate some income, and how to manage that income for the benefit of the community. And that kind of development is now being implemented all over in Malaysia, and now they are helping communities in Indonesia to build their micro hydro, transfer the knowledge. So in the language of other people, they call this the South exchange, that we are learning from each other, the indigenous knowledge. And by the way, they make micro hydro from renewable recycled materials, aluminum. So they produce, it's tailor fit. So they tailor the kind of micro hydro to what the community needs. So this has been now replicated in Sabah. And as Athena has mentioned, there's actually an association of small renewable energy, community-based renewable energy in Southeast Asia, and they're facilitating, exchange and lessons learned and skills, and that is really driving a lot of community-based renewable energy, because that is what fits community, as Athena has mentioned. It fits what they need, and so the solution is not necessarily big. And that's what we're saying. We don't have to go big. The solutions can be small, and that is more manageable, and it's more sustainable than, so we need to, as Ikau said, be out of the box, right? And really think what is the interest of communities, and how do they want to proceed with addressing their needs, including on the issue of renewable energy.
Thanks so much, John. Actually, the next question is also for the panelists, but if we could start with you, John. It's about the efforts that are being made by indigenous peoples to receive compensation for the use of their natural resources, as well as access to the energy that is developed. perhaps in contract with locked-in rates over multiple years with incremental increasing rates. Is that something that is interesting to the indigenous people?
I think Athena has partly responded.
Yes.
Oh, yes, Athena has partly responded to that question. But the model that is being done now for the return of I mean having benefits is the payment for ecological services, right? That communities that are providing ecological service get compensated for that. That is still not the common or the trend, but I know that in certain communities and in the Philippines, those that are protecting the watershed, which is supplying irrigation to the lower part, are actually paying those that are protecting the watershed, because without their protection, they will not get the water for their irrigation. So the farmers are paying back from the services that they get, and that was voluntarily done, right, by the farmers in the lower area, saying that since we recognize that you are providing us, we want to compensate you so that you are encouraged to continue to protect the watershed. So it's like a community to community support in terms of acknowledging the kind of benefits that others get from the protection of ecosystems.
Fabia, but let me just jump in there. The example for John is really great because that's a very communal one. So if you look at here in Kenya, where community energy projects are really, they're blocked by government because, well, it's not government and it's not corporate who's running it. So you see, one, the biggest question, even for all of us, is compensation for what? Because when you don't recognize what land, what resources that is being extracted from the region, then the big question is, what exactly are you compensating? The valuation of our lands and territories is very minimal because it is seen to be not productive lands. So it starts from there. If the calculation, the valuation of lands and territories is skewed against the communities, then the compensation, like in the Kenyan case, land valuation laws are being made so that because I do not have house or crops on my land because it is rangelands, it is grazing area, the land value is zero. So then the compensation is minimal or non-existent. So I think that's the best place to start. What is being compensated? The second one is, again, the energy laws that are being made. So again, the case I gave for the Lake Turkana wind farm, based on our energy laws, the conversation of benefit sharing focused on mining and oil. But then green energy, it is within the laws that it comes in through the green climate funds, green bonds, etc. All this, in my opinion, illicit financial flows that are calculated in the Silicon Valley, and our governments are given peanuts, which they take because they think it's free money. So you have all this, a global system that continues to, if you ask any African government to tell you what they get for the clean energy, they will tell you it comes under climate bonds. And those climate bonds are not, they're not on the table when those climate bonds are being calculated. So the companies that are doing this are sitting in the Silicon Valley. So again, we are still just recipients of something that we don't know what, because again, our own governments believe this is free land that has been given to a corporate company to develop energy that the government benefits from. What the community lost out of it is not there. What really the energy value is, our governments do not know. But then again, it's not in their geographies. It is a local indigenous community who's either lost their land and livelihood. So I think a lot of this compensations, we've got to start to ask ourselves, what exactly is being compensated, who is being compensated, and for how long? Because these energy companies, continue. If you look at the stock exchange, they're never in our countries, they're in the global north. They continue to go up in value. And then our value, our compensation is based on the land value as of today. And for the next 100 years, 5 generations from today, we will be compensating at the same amount, yet the value of those companies continues to go up. So when we think about compensation, we've got to ask ourselves, what exactly is being compensated and how is that calculation done?
Thank you, Ikau. Another question for the panelists. If you could please start, Ikau. But the question is, we are seeing very limited implementation of the free, prior, and informed consent protocols and a variety of interpretations of this protocol by the people that are responsible for implementing it. Are those protocols helpful, and how can we advance a unified understanding of those protocols of free, prior, and informed consent? Ikau, if you could start.
Yes.
Well, I feel that over time, the discussion on free, prior, informed consent has been weakened. We looked at it a lot when it came to the destructive projects. Then now with clean energy, it's sort of pushed aside, and there is a lot more that could be done on it. I think one thing we have to recognize is that free, prior, informed consent existed. And before even it was passed by, it became a global principle and a global conversation. All our communities had free, prior, informed consent. How you access land, how you access grazing, how you access a shared water point was really through a principle of free, prior, informed consent. So if we see it from that perspective, I think it is supporting communities to continue and not see the engagement with projects, be they clean energy, be they government projects, as separate from. So I feel that that's the first place to begin. And then also the change, I think because we think it's a green project, it's a good project, there is a focus to reduce and say consultation, consent, and etc. Do communities really have a right to say no? That then remains, because then we keep saying free, prior, informed consent. Some governments have signed on to it. Many African global South governments have not signed on to it. But then we are never leaving communities to actually give consent. And the fact that because the projects are so timely because of some financing, we rush the process. And sometimes the civil society come in and want to rush communities because the consultation and the consent process within communities takes a longer time. But many of the organizations, because we are now either doing working, stakeholder engagement, all these big terms, we want to rush the process and to okay the fact that free, prior, informed consent took place, but mostly doesn't. And so I think that it is true and we need to do better.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Can I add?
John?
Just to add to Ikau, there's actually a deliberate attempt by some groups to distort the substance and spirit of free, prior, and informed consent and reduce it to a tick in the box kind of exercise as simply a procedural matter, which is not the case, right? But because the key word in the FPIC is the consent. It's the consent that communities have the right to say yes or no to a project as a collective decision, which is different from consultation. And that consent, it should be sought as a free and before any project starts, and free, prior, and that decisions are made through right information. That's what it is, the consent, the decision. So we have to discern really on having a better understanding of free, prior, and informed consent. And the principle as well is that the final judgment on how this will be done are the communities that are exercising their right. It's part of their self-determination. Nobody can tell them how FPIC will be done. It's them to decide on how that will be undertaken, especially in the way they undertake their decision-making processes. And that takes time because communities have to deliberate on the information provided to them, on the pros and cons and other considerations. And that is the right of communities to do so. as part of the FPIC. So we need to really understand it from the perspective of the rights holders and not those wanting to reduce this as a mere exercise, as a mere tick in the box exercise, so they can simply say that they have done it.
Thank you, John. Actually, the next question is to you, but obviously, Ikau, feel free to weigh in as well. The question is, how can you, if you could, talk a little bit, John, about the lithium mining for green energy, which has, according to this panelist, this questioner, wreaked destruction on indigenous peoples in South America and now has come to Nevada in the US. And he asks, when indigenous communities only suffer the consequences, not the benefits, what should happen then to help protect them and their land bases from further colonization? What happens when indigenous communities do not want exploitation of their land, but face powers bigger than them?
Yeah, and unfortunately, that's really the situation for many communities, that we face the powerful, right? By asserting our rights, we are challenging the powers that be, because they have the economic interest to take over our resources. As Athena has mentioned, there is this conflict, right? There's the interests are really different. So we are aware that we are basically fighting a giant. And that is where I think strengthening the solidarity across indigenous peoples across different countries, but also building alliances with human rights organizations, NGOs, using the media, building allies among the media and others is a way for us to challenge those powers and try to disrupt how they are using their power against us, and that the others will stand by us in defending our rights. And by defending our rights to our lands, territories, and resources, we are actually also contributing to the sustainable use of resources for the common good. We are preventing the control of corporations over these territories. So there are common interests with other groups that we can unite in relation to protecting the lands and resources of indigenous peoples. And I think that's really the power that we have, no? The numbers and the cooperation and the solidarity that we build is the power that we have against those powerful people with vested interest over our resources.
And just to add on to that, Fabio, I see a question here from Chennai, and which links to the conversation around tenure. Yes, we can have title to a land, but do we own the resources that exist on our lands and territories? And if we can expand the discussion on, we can just expand the discussion on land ownership and tenure to really, the resources. Because just as the question was asked, if then the local communities do not want extraction from their lands, do they have a say if the state feels that the land is theirs, but the resources are for the state? And how do we have that conversation? I think really this webinar and more webinars, more conversations and dialogues around these topics are very critical, beyond just the securing tenure and getting title. Yet the resources, it's not just the land on its own, but the resources on the land is what the state wants, it's what the corporations want. And do local communities, do indigenous communities, do rural populations have ownership of the resources on their lands? And that for me is a very critical discussion to expand on. That way communities can negotiate from a place of knowing, because many times they say, yes, the land is yours, but what's underneath is ours as the state or as public, or is, that discussion has also in many ways been used to fragment the collective within communities. And that's what is then the elite come in and become the negotiators for communities, because they feel that, well, since it can't stay here, somebody's got to benefit, and mostly the elites from the indigenous communities are the ones who benefit from it.
Thanks, Ikau. I have one more question, and I think it's a very interesting one for us to end on. It's a comment actually, and then a question. The comment is, in Norway, the Sami have won a major victory at the Supreme Court, and some of the Sami people are calling for the wind farm, which was constructed by violating their rights, to be torn down. And he asks, how can this be navigated? Can the damage be undone? And what can we do when it's too late? Like, what can we do when the project is already there? It has caused the damage, but now how can we compensate for that damage? I think it's a very interesting question. Joan, if you could start.
Yeah, I think I've seen that, and I'm quite familiar with that case. The decision of the Supreme Court was based on the civil and political rights and economic rights of the Sami over their livelihoods, and that is in relation to the reindeer herding, and that is why the windmills are preventing them from doing their reindeer herding as a traditional livelihood. So now they are actually asking those windmills to be torn down, so that the land can again be used as the grazing land for the reindeers, and that is still possible. That's why they want the windmills to be taken out, so that they can restore the land as the grazing land of the reindeers. That's how I understood. So it's and the windmills were built in 2020, right? So it's the physical obstruction of the windmill that is disturbing the reindeer herding. So if that's taken out, they can still rehabilitate the area and restore it back, I hope, as a grazing land for the reindeer. So I don't think it's too late, as long as the windmills are taken down, that they are transferred somewhere else, that will not affect the Sami people, because the Samis are saying they are not against the windmill per se, as long as those windmills are put in an area where it does not affect them in a negative way. And there are areas in Norway where out there, it's a huge country, that they can put the windmill and nobody will be bothered by it. So that's why they are surprised that how come they built it in their reindeer herding area, when there are other options to build it. So
Ikau, do you want to weigh in on this? On how do we fix when something has gone this wrong?
Well, polluter pays principle. So the person who set it up, it might not be pollution per se, but it is polluting the grazing areas of the Sami. So the company, all the participants who participate in the process of setting it up should pay and meet the cost of it. That would be my opinion. Same to what Joan is saying. People think that it is easier to move the usually poor peasant pastoralists, and in this case reindeer pastoralists, and set up the infrastructure, but the same infrastructure can be moved. So if it can be moved, I think it should be moved, and let the rehabilitate. So it's not only the moving. I think it should also, the cost polluter pay principle should also be used to cost the reclamation of the grazing lands for the reindeer, because it is not only, someone might think, what is reindeer? I think something that should be recognized is the Sami have a particular, a sense of belonging and identity to the livelihoods that they partake in, and it is important for all parties to see it that way. Fabio, I think you're on mute.
So sorry, and thank you, Ikau, for noticing. So I was thanking everyone for the questions, and I'm sorry we didn't have the time to address all of them. Now we are moving to concluding thoughts. If you could, John, talk a little bit, have your final thoughts on this webinar and your final thoughts on this issue. John, can you hear me?
John, can you?
Oh, sorry. I did not know that I was off. Yeah. Sorry.
No worries. Did you hear me, or do you want me to repeat? It's
Yeah.
basically.
Can you please? Yeah. I wasn't able
sorry.
to catch
Oh,
that
no
question.
problem. No, I was just asking if you have any concluding thoughts about the webinar and about this issue that we addressed here.
Okay, yeah. So yes, I think this has been a very interesting exchange, and there's a lot of issues to explore or to further get into, but I think it's really important to fully understand the issues around renewable energy and indigenous peoples, especially also how it relates to land tenure, to self-governance of in indigenous peoples, but also in relation to solutions to climate change under the just transition and in advancing the SDGs. So I hope this discussion is just an initial trigger to more discussions and more conversation around this issue, and I hope we will be together in really advocating for the urgency to recognize and respect the rights of indigenous peoples, especially in relation to land tenure as an urgent issue and a matter of survival and dignity for indigenous peoples. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Ikau, concluding thoughts?
Yeah, I think it is very important. This discussion on the energy transition, renewable energy is looked at from an environmental ecological perspective. I think to really recognize and shift power to indigenous people and local communities, we've got to look at it holistically and see the economic, social, political nexus that we all need to work with to ensure that it's not only about changing power, giving a little bit of free, prior, informed consent, but it is really giving real power to indigenous people and local communities, that they actually can be part of the decision-making around what design of energy they want, what mix of energy they want, but how they can also be part of the ownership of this. Because if you're not really owning this process, then mostly you're just consulted when there's a crisis or when they need to take something from you. And I think it is important what Athena was saying. Then the business communities, the owners of capital, owners, venture, the venture partnerships really need to look at ways that they genuinely engage indigenous people as partners, yes, as owners of the land, but really partners in the enterprise that they want to build. And I'm hoping that we can continue to expand this conversation, that looking at tenure beyond just the title, but really expanding it to how communities can own, can do business with the lands and territories that we own and occupy in ways that are not only for now, but really so that we can start to build that generational wealth for our children and children's children.
Thank you, Ikau. Thank you, everyone. So, and thanks to the other panelists who are not here, Athena and Marcelo. And thank to our hosts, the Ford Foundation, the Land Portal Foundation, the Tenure Facility, and the Thomson Reuters Foundation. I hope it was enjoyable for everyone and intellectually rewarding. Please note that a recording of this webinar is going to be available in a few days. And please look out for the next iteration of the Land Dialogue webinar series on financing. Thank you, that will take place in November. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.